Hello, class. Professor Baggett here, ready to discuss our first introductory lecture called What is History? And this has to do what I referred to in my video welcoming remarks, that in this class we're going to take a slightly different tact in how to look at history, in that we're going to look at the ways people, historians, interpret history. And I thought we would start off with a photograph of a fairly recent event in American history, and how journalists vigorously disagreed about what's going on in this photograph, particularly what is the state of mind of the people sitting there in the foreground. Now, it's often said that journalism is the first draft of history. So if we can see that we disagree about events in present-day America, clearly that helps us understand that, of course, historians would disagree as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about this picture, and we're going to talk about the different interpretations people have. And then we're going to move on to the two schools of thought I referred to in the video, New Left historians and neoconservative historians, and how, as you answer your essay questions, after you deliver the content of the lectures in terms of the narrative of factual events, you will then be called upon to interpret that particular event or period in history according to these two schools of thought. Or, as I said before, you want to make up your own school of thought, you're welcome to do that. Now, as we look at this picture, it shouldn't take too long, I would think, for you to figure out that this is a picture of New York City in September 11th, 2001. This picture was taken by a freelance photographer by the name of Thomas Hoepker, who grabbed his camera when he saw the events on TV and went out taking pictures. Now, this picture was taken in Brooklyn, which is across the river there from Manhattan, where the attacks took place. Now, Mr. Hoepker, when he went to the New York Times and they were looking for what photographs he took that day to publish, they looked at this photograph and they decided not to publish it. He said, quote, talking about the people, "They were totally relaxed, like any normal afternoon. It's possible they lost people and cared, but they were not stirred by it." He withheld the photograph from publication because, quote, "We didn't need to see that then." He feared it would, quote, "stir the wrong emotions." But, quote, "over time, with perspective, it grew in importance." So 5 years later, when there was a book of photographs called Watching the World Change, it was decided to put this photograph in that book because, as Mr. Hoepker said, it grew in importance over time with perspective. So in 2006, this photograph is published in this book. And as you can imagine, it's a book of tremendously dramatic photographs. But this one caught the attention of many people because of the difficulty in interpreting what is going on in the mind of the people who were sitting in the foreground. Now, Frank Rich who was at that time an editorial writer for the New York Times, a very influential editorial writer, wrote a piece called Whatever Happened to the America of 9/12. And he writes about this photograph. He said, it shows, quote, it shows 5 young friends on the waterfront, excuse me, in Brooklyn, taking what seems to be a lunch or bike riding break, enjoying the radiant late summer sun and chatting away as cascades of smoke engulf lower Manhattan in the background. Seen from the perspective of 9/11's 5th anniversary, Mr. Hooper's photo is a snapshot of history soon to come. What he caught was this. Traumatic as the attack on America was, 9/11 would recede quickly for many. This is a country that likes to move on and fast. The young people in Mr. Hooker's photo aren't necessarily callous. They're just American. Wow. So he goes on to say that in 9/11, in the general culture of America in 9/11, Americans feasted on reality programs, nonstop coverage of child abductions and sex scandals. 5 years later, they still do. The day that changed everything didn't make Americans change the channel, unless it was from Fear Factor to American Idol, or from Pamela Anderson to Paris Hilton. Now, so what he's saying is he's criticizing the shallowness of American people and American culture. And to him, this photograph represents that very well. Now, if we were to agree with him, I guess we would ask ourselves, in 2019, 18 years later, are we still feasting on sex scandals and child abduction stories? I would say, regardless of your point of view, it's pretty obvious we are. And although Pamela Anderson or Paris Hilton are really no longer in the picture as celebrities, what about the Bachelorette or the Bachelor or the Real Housewives of New York, Beverly Hills, Atlanta, the Potomac? Where else do they have those? In other words, 18 years later, we're still in this type of shallow culture that we were in 2001. So that editorial got a lot of attention, particularly because there were people who agreed with Rich, and there were people who thought that he was attacking America, Americans, and American culture. Well, along comes another journalist by the name of David Plotz, and the title of his article is Frank Rich is Wrong About That 9/11 Photograph. He says, after quoting Rich and what he said about they're not necessarily callous, they're just Americans, Plotz goes, but wait, look at that photograph. Do you agree with Rich's account of it? Do these look like 5 New Yorkers who are enjoying the radiant late summer sun and chatting away, who have moved on, who in Rich's malicious backhanded swipe, quote, aren't necessarily callous? They don't to me. I wasn't there, and Hooper was, and so it may be just as well that they were swapping stories about the Yankees. But I doubt it. The subjects are obviously engaged with each other. and they're almost certainly discussing the horrific event unfolding behind them. They have looked away from the towers for a moment, not because they're bored with 9/11, but because they're citizens participating in the most important act in a democracy, civic debate. Ask yourself, what are these 5 people doing out on the waterfront anyway? Do you really think, as Rich suggests, that they are out for a lunch or bike riding break? Of course not. They came to the spot to watch their country's history unfold and to be with each other at a time of national emergency. Short of rushing to ground zero and digging for bodies, how much more patriotic and concerned could they have been? I spent much of the day glued to my TV set, but I also spent it racing home to be with my infant daughter, calling my parents and New York relatives, and talking with colleagues and friends. Those discussions were exactly the kind of communal engagement I see in this photo. There's nothing shocking in this picture. These New Yorkers have not turned away from Manhattan because they have turned away from 9/11. They have turned away from Manhattan because they have turned towards each other for solace and for debate. So, 2 starkly different interpretations of a photograph. And we like to think of photographs as sort of truthful mediums of what's happening. But that's not true. Photographs are also open to interpretation, as we see here. And if journalists and Americans can disagree on the difference on what is happening in a photograph or what's happening in terms of any current event, then again it's obvious that historians do as well. And the times we live in particular, we're a very, very divided country. We have a president who might tweet something out, and half of the country might say, well, that's perfect, makes perfect sense. Good for him, he knows what he's doing. And the other half of the country might say, this makes no sense at all. So, what's true of the present is true of the past. And as I said in the welcoming video, with every topic we address, we're going to talk about disagreements or how historians disagree about what happened and who was the important person or people in that story. Okay, so let's move along to the word historiography. And historiography simply means schools of historical thought that change over time. And as I said earlier, there are many different schools, really starting in the early 1830s, but we're going to deal with late 20th and early 21st century schools. And the first is the New Left. The New Left writes about what they call social history. They believe history is the history of everyday people who've been left out of history: women, immigrants, working class, African Americans, ethnic groups, etc. Now, the New Left came out of the 1960s. And in the 1960s into the 1970s, you have for the first time women, working class people, African Americans, people from these groups who are increasingly going into graduate programs, getting their PhDs to be professors, to teach and write about history. And they were struck growing up about how their stories were not told in history books. And they feel, unless you tell the history of everyday people, you cannot have a sense of the country and what happened in the past in the country. Neoconservatives, however, our second group, do not like social history. They believe that true history is political history, military history, diplomatic history. They believe that true history is the history of presidents, of generals, of those who served as diplomats. Now, by definition, that means the majority of history they're writing and teaching has to deal with white men. Until, of course, we have President Obama, we have Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State and Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General. So you have a handful of women, Nancy Pelosi is the first Speaker of the House, etc., who you have a handful of people from different backgrounds who have made it up the ladder in American politics and American government. But for the most part, still, it's overwhelmingly Caucasian and overwhelmingly male that neoconservatives feel are the genuinely important people, because they're the ones who've had the power, they're the ones who've made the decisions that have changed the course of history, and that's not true of some immigrant off the boat, etc. So this start off with two very stark differences between the two groups. Neoconservatives also believe that multiculturalism is destructive to the writing of history. Now, the New Left believes very much in multiculturalism. Obviously, when you look at the groups of people they're interested in writing about. The neoconservatives feel that multiculturalism is, and one neoconservative historian said, it was really just therapy for people from these groups of social history to feel better about themselves by being in history books, and that's no reason to be in history books. So you can see how things are being set up here. In the New Left, it's not just the question of social history, but another aspect of them is what they call a usable past, that you can look to the past to help guide us today to make decisions that will change history in present-day America. And that's because many New Left historians have been and were activists themselves. Many New Left historians came out of the Civil Rights Movement. They came out of the anti-war movement during Vietnam. They came out of the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. They looked in the past and saw abolitionists, women who fought for the right to vote, previous anti-war movements in American history. World War I actually had a pretty organized anti-war movement. And they see these events and groups of people in the past that can help them and Americans make decisions about the present. They believe very strongly that history is an interpretation. So is history an art, or is history a science? New Left historians would say it's an art. And they would argue there's no such thing as objective truth. And the example of that photograph would be a case in point. What's the objective truth of that photograph? I'm not sure we can say it is because Frank Rich has one objective truth and David Plotz has another objective truth. So where does that leave us? The neoconservatives, however, disagree. They attacked the New Left historians, saying that social history is simply political correctness, that all these groups today feel that they have to be acknowledged, and whether they really made any important contributions that are not, and that's not befitting the standards of history. They believe that history is a science. It's not an art. History is a compilation of facts. And they believe there is such a thing as objective truth. At the end of the day, you can find the truth. Now, that's a brief introduction. There are other aspects to it. For example, neoconservatives have a tendency to believe in small government, laissez-faire government. They believe that America is an even playing field now. Whether you're successful or not depends on how hard you work, your education, etc. Whereas the New Left believes in a strong government and believes the government has a moral obligation to help Americans in times of trouble. So we'll see when we get to the Great Depression and the New Deal how dramatically these two groups differ. Neoconservatives were very much against the New Deal, and the New Left supported it. So what other general questions do we need to look at when we're trying to decide about what interpretations we want to consider in writing our essays? How does a people interpret their history? Do divisions matter? Class. Now, there are those who argue America does not have a class system, say as in England. We don't have an aristocracy. We don't have a proletariat. But others will argue, yes, indeed, America has a class system. You have the upper 1% owning most of everything, and the lower percent owning pretty large majority of Americans, certainly not in that category and struggling to keep up. So we are a society based on economic divisions. Now again, the New Left historians will say that's because of structural inequalities in the economic system, and the government has a responsibility to do something about this unfair structure, whether it's tax rates or whatever, or legislation favoring corporations and wealthy individuals. And the government has a responsibility to address this and make things more equitable and fair. The neoconservatives would say, if you do well, good for you. And that's the way America is structured. For those who work hard and keep their nose clean and follow the rules, congratulations for your success. That's what America is about, and you can do it no matter where you come from. And the government does not owe the lower classes anything in terms of changing the economic structure, because the economic structure is not the problem. The problem is with the individual. Race. Do racial divisions matter in American history? New Left historians will say they certainly do. It's slavery is what's called the original sin in American history. And the history of race relations in the past has left a legacy of racial division today. The neoconservatives would argue, well, yes, certainly there was the horrible experience of enslavement, and Reconstruction did not end well. And then there were Jim Crow laws and problems African Americans had. There was the Civil Rights Movement, which addressed some of those. Although some neoconservatives don't believe in some of that civil rights legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because they felt that was federal government interference in what should be state affairs. But nevertheless, let's say there are neoconservatives, and there are, who think those were important milestones of legislation to redress past wrongdoings. Neoconservatives would argue today there is a level playing field in America when it comes to race. An African American became president of the United States. If that's the case, then anyone can make it to the top. Again, just as in the case with class, it depends on your ability to work hard, how much you've been able to get an education, etc. America is a level playing field now for you as well. New left historians would disagree. Gender and sexuality. Again, when we come to the discussion of the emergence of modern feminism, the same things in terms of race and class. Is there still a structural sort of composite in America that makes it difficult for women to rise to the top? Are there still things in society in terms of attitudes, opinions, cultural assumptions that keep women down, as the New Left would argue? And neoconservatives would argue the same as they do in race and class. Women, it's a level playing field for women. The sky's the limit for women. We've reached a point in history where it's all up to the individual as to whether or not they're going to be successful. And sexuality, which is a topic of debate today as well, and that comes down to a more rudimentary question, and that is, should people, the LGBTQ community, have equal legal rights as heterosexual Americans? The New Left says yes, and neoconservatives say no, that basic legal and civil rights should not be based on a sexual orientation. That is not covered by the 14th Amendment, and there should be no federal legislation to address those inequities. And what it is today is some states have protections in terms of being fired or being evicted or public accommodations, but other states do not. And neoconservatives would be willing to leave it up to the states, whereas New Left individuals think it should be federal protections that would protect everyone, everywhere. Geographic divisions. Are we still divided by North and South? Are we divided by the heartland in between the two coasts? There's this one book, I forget the title of it, but this author argues that there are really 11 different nations within America based on geography. Or has everything through television and social media, etc., made us a really homogeneous society without these type of divisions? And can we overcome these divisions? I think a lot of what you need to think about when you're writing your essays are you really an optimist or a pessimist when you look at history? Do you see history as a steady advance of progress, or do you see history as one step forward and two steps back? That's something to be thinking about. A lot of what will happen when you try to determine where you stand on these questions is sort of to figure out where you stand generally in your view of life and your view of contemporary politics and American society. So if you can figure that out, it'll help inform the positions you take on the past. Now here's a contemporary example of divisions in this country that would cover geography, that would cover race, and that some would argue even cover class, and that we've had vigorous, even violent debates over whether or not Confederate memorials should be removed. Some people say they should because they glorize human enslavement and men who fought for human enslavement. Others say, well, you may not like, well, often what they'll say is these memorials, and such as the Confederate flag, are not really about slavery. They're about the history of a particular culture within America. and should be honored. So the bottom line is there are all sorts of potential divisions, or are they really divisions? Are we at a point where we can move past these divisions? Or does the Daily News remind us that we haven't quite made it yet? So this is just a little food for thought. I know you're probably thinking, I'm not sure how this is all supposed to fit in, but you will become more aware of it as time goes on. Okay, thank you very much. And now we're going to move into Reconstruction.